So those are some nutrients of consideration that we definitely want to make sure we're focusing on in plant-based diets. But as you can see, other than vitamin B12, we're seeing, that vegans are getting this amount. And if they're not, it's actually, an issue across the board, not just in vegans and vegetarians oftentimes. All right, so we're going to hop into, I'm going to leave some time for questions here for sure. But the next step of the approach that I use with counseling my patients is the how. So we talked a lot about the why, which I think is super important for us to understand, but we can't talk about the why without understanding the how. How do I implement this if I'm very new to it? Or how do I implement some of these things if I am already adopting a plant-based diet, but really want to refine it to reduce my risk of cancer recurrence as much as possible? So some recommendations for implementation. First things that I always want to talk about is that plant-based doesn't have to mean restriction. I think this is definitely a debate in the dietitian world, and there's some extreme views on one side or the other among dietitians, and some believe that a plant-based is a restrictive diet and not necessarily healthy. And I do think that in some individuals that have a history of eating disorders, that this is an important consideration and an individual approach that needs to be made of whether that can impact their history or even a current eating disorder. However, in the general healthy population that doesn't have a history of eating disorder, plant-based diets does not have to mean restriction. In my own personal situation, I actually believe that as I adopted a plant-based diet, I actually opened my world and options to a lot more plant-based or to a lot more foods and flavorings than I ever had before. And I actually feel like I have a less restrictive diet than I did when I was an omnivorous eater. I think it's also important for someone to understand their values and goals. I think sometimes some dietitians that maybe aren't interested in having patients adopt a plant-based diet, they don't seek to understand why a patient might wanting to adopt that. So depending on if you're working with someone or even a physician that, maybe has some really big red flags, if you wanted to tell them that you wanted to adopt a plant-based diet, I think it's important for people to understand why you might be wanting to adopt a plant-based diet and like what values and goals surround that. And in that case, intuitive eating can also be plant-based eating. We don't have a lot of time to dive into what intuitive eating is, but it's really eating based on your intuition and using your own hunger cues and listening to those and body awareness to help make sure that we're eating adequate amounts. So intuitive eating definitely can be plant-based eating. And individuals that are transitioning to a plant-based diet, they might consider a slow, gradual adoption or a quick transition. I've worked with a few patients that 180 degrees, they change their diet overnight, especially after a diagnosis. I can speak firsthand that after a diagnosis, you're oftentimes much more motivated to just make that change right away. Not the case for everybody, but it might be a slow, gradual adoption. And I think sometimes in the plant-based nutrition world, people often might criticize people for not being fully plant-based overall or right away. And I think that is actually really hurting from this standpoint, because sometimes people are like, oh man, if I'm going to get this kind of shame around not being fully plant-based or not being fully plant-based quickly, then I'm just not going to do it at all. And I really think that anytime we can support someone in being more plant-based and getting closer to whole food plant-based as much as possible, that's really a win for not only their health, but also our environment, planet, et cetera. So really making sure that we are focusing on where that individual is and what might be best for their transition. Personally, I did my plant-based transition probably over a couple months rather than just overnight. I decided one day that I wasn't going to eat meat for the month of September. And I honestly never looked back. But at the beginning of that month of September, I never thought that I would never eat meat again. But I haven't since then. Dairy was a little bit more difficult for me, and it took several more months for me to completely get rid of it. But for me, that was the most successful, sustainable way to do it. And I think we really need to focus on individuals and what's best for them. Also, the New American Plate from the AICR, I think, has a really great method of showing transition. The old American Plate might be what someone's diet looks like. However, you can start to transition that depending on where you are. If your plate looks a little bit more like the first one, start changing it slowly but surely. And then over here to stage 3, like the new American plate or another option, which is really where you're using limited animal foods. Or of course, I like to present another option that is entirely plant-based. Again, anytime we move to a more plant-based option, we really start to see benefits overall. So some final thoughts before we get to questions here is that research really does show that plant-based diets can provide significant health benefits compared to non-vegetarian diets, especially for heart disease, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, cancer, and obesity. Also, we want to make sure that we ensure energy balance, nutrition adequacy with a focus on fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds to make sure we're maximizing the health benefits. And of course, supplementation or specific food focus may be necessary, but this is like any other dietary pattern. We need to make sure that we're ensuring adequacy for any dietary pattern. And in the case of fully plant-based, that we do want to make sure that we're having a vitamin D supplementation. And then also future considerations in environment and animal advocacy are an important piece and can have greater meaning for one individual over another. So that's a consideration to think about. Some final thoughts from me before we go into the Q&A is that it's important to understand the recommendations for cancer prevention are intended to work together and be adopted as a lifestyle package, right? Again, it's not just one nutrient or one food. And the recommendations that we talked about, they really do promote an overall healthy way of life to reduce not only cancer, but other non-communicable diseases and obesity. And this is an especially important role that we play in cancer survivorship. Of course, some of my favorite professional resources to share with you. If you grab the PDF slides after today's presentation, you'll have the links to each of these. Of course, over at my website, I do have some recipes, some blog posts, and then options to work with me. Also, American Institute for Cancer Research, PCRM, Cook for Your Life. There's lots of different resources that are available here. And so key takeaways, really, I don't necessarily want to hone in on too much because I feel like we did a really good job talking about it already, but a diet and lifestyle focused on whole plant foods, rich in fiber and phytonutrients appears to have a greater protection against cancer incidence than any other dietary pattern, primarily because these foods and this lifestyle helps reduce, increase apoptosis to an appropriate level, reduce proliferation, reduce inflammation, make sure that we have genome stability, and all of those things that we talked about in that deep understanding of why. Also, a registered dietitian and oncology dietitian can play a powerful role in all stages of cancer treatment and survivorship. And a plant-forward or exclusively plant-based diet can be nutritionally adequate and reduce the risk of cancer and other diseases. But we do want to make sure that we are having it be appropriately planned to ensure nutritional adequacy. All right. So I'm curious, after participating in this presentation, there were several people that said that they did believe that nutrition played a big role. One person talked about that they're not really sure. What now comes to mind as it relates to nutrition and cancer? Is there anything that after this presentation, seeing it, that either surprised you or that you're like, man, I really wish more people knew this? Is there anything that comes to mind? Hopefully you've gained a lot of insight through this presentation. If you're pretty well versed in nutrition and cancer coming into it, hopefully you learned some new things, and that would be obviously my goal for whether you're new to it or pretty well versed, that everybody is walking away today learning some new things. All right, I'm not seeing any answers right now, so I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next slide. Here we go. That more people knew the science behind it. Absolutely. I definitely believe that knowing the science behind it, and hopefully it can be explained to them into an easy to understand manner, because the science and, all the nuances about it and all that can be really intimidating for somebody that maybe isn't in the medical field to want to learn these things. So I really find it really important for myself to try to teach people this in a sometimes complicated, terminology that we don't necessarily understand, but understand it in a way that all of us can understand it to move that forward. Thank you for sharing that. All right, so I want to give you an opportunity that if you want today's slides, and then also I'll send you a 5-day plant-based meal plan to go with it. All you have to do is you can scan this QR code and it will send you to a slide that looks like this, today's presentation handouts. You can put your name and your email in there, and then I'll automatically send you the slides, but also all the references that I cited during today's presentation. I'll send you the PDF slides, the references as a separate PDF, and then also a 5-day meal plan that I created to help people, incorporate more cancer-fighting foods into their table, into their diet, and bring more of those foods to their table. So you can scan the QR code there, or you can visit wholesomeprograms.com/real truth about health. So I'm going to leave that slide up there, and then we can definitely transition to Q&A now. And then hopefully I can keep this slide up for anybody that does want to grab those slides. You still have the URL or the QR code to do that. So I will leave it over to the Real Truth team to help move through some of the questions now.
All right. Thank you so much, Alison, for that very informative presentation. So we're now going to begin our Q&A session. We have a relatively short period of time for this Q&A, but we'll get it in as much as we can. So before we begin, I guess you've given all the contact details to the audience, so that's great. I just want to go over a couple of quick things regarding the Q&A. So first of all, we will not be taking any questions directly from the chat. What we will be doing is taking questions through raising your hand in Zoom. In order to do so, at the bottom right, second from the right in Zoom, you'll see a reactions button. You're going to click on the reactions button, and then you'll click on raise hand in the pop-up window. When we will then take questions in the order in which they were received. When it's your turn, I will prompt you to state where you're from and ask your question. We ask that everyone keep their questions brief and on topic. We will then mute you. If you'd like to ask a follow-up question, you may do so only after you can basically get it back online and raise your hand again. So we can go ahead and begin. And I see we have a few people who are ready to ask questions of you. So we have Marley. Marley, please state where you're from and ask your question.
Hi, I'm from Hollywood, Florida. Thank you, Alison. Great presentation. Do you recommend nutritional testing? And if so, which ones?
Really great question. I've been to Hollywood, Florida once, beautiful area. So I think it really depends on the individual and what they potentially might be at risk for. So a nutritional panel done by your physician can be really helpful. I don't have any specific ones that I want to specifically endorse for like a full nutrition panel. But when I'm talking to individual clients, I definitely focus on, okay, what about that person as an individual? But overall, usually I always want to see what is that person's what is the fasting glucose for that person? Also their A1C, and potentially even like their fasting insulin to see if we can have any insulin resistance occurring. But definitely vitamin D is a really common one. A lipid panel is one that I want to see. And then sometimes I'll even go into an iron panel, B12 and folate panel, because I want to see if there's any deficiencies there that may be causing anemia. And one that I've recently been using a lot more with my own clients is an omega-3 index test. And I particularly use this a lot with my completely vegan patients, because I want to see what their level of omega-3s are, and if we need to change some of their dietary foods that they're consuming to help increase that level of omega-3s, or if a supplement might be warranted. So I think those kind of hit on the big ones that I'm usually asking people for. And outside of that, I'm really looking at that individual person, and if there's something else that's glaring that might be something we need to be looking at.
Great. Thank you so much, Alison, for that answer.
Mm-hmm.
Our next question is coming from Stephen. Stephen, please state where you're from and ask your question.
Hi, Rockaway, New York. Can you hear me?
Yes,
yep,
we can.
We can hear you.
Oh, okay. Brian Clement has come down in Hippocrates, they use high phenolic olive oil, particularly when it comes to malignancies. Ralph Moss recently came out with the an analysis, a meta-analysis also about incorporating high phenolic olive oil. But there's a whole lineup of our presenters here on The Truth About Health that are dead set against any kind of oils.
Okay.
That's the question.
Yeah, great question, Stephen. Thank you for asking it. And I will tell you, this is probably one of the most controversial topics when it comes to the plant-based diet and among different experts in terms of its use, in terms of oils in the diet. Should there be oils? Should there not be oils? Should there be minimal amounts? I'll tell you my professional opinion. You may or may not like this answer, but it depends on the individual. Because I think we need to assess their overall health status. Do they have heart disease? Do they not have heart disease? But I think it also comes into play that when we use oils, what types of oils are we using? Are we using high quality oils? And how much are we using them? Does the individual need to achieve a healthier weight? And is the use of the oil going to impact how they are able to achieve that healthier weight? And the other thing that I take into consideration is, what is that person's lifestyle like, right? I'll give you an example. I have 2 young kids and a husband. We eat plant-based at home. When my husband cooks meals, he uses oil. Do I complain? Nope, because he's making dinner, right? So I think that all of those elements need to be playing a role. I do think that there is some great information about the high polyphenol oils and so forth. I encourage overall, my general recommendation for people is to, if you're using oils, use high quality oils, such as some of these really good extra virgin olive oils, maybe an avocado oil, high heat, etc. But using minimal amounts of it and using just as much as you need. And I usually encourage people to try to, if the recipe calls for 2 tablespoons, just maybe try 1, see how it turns out. So I think there's a lot of variables at play. I think there's more research that needs to be done. That's where I stand on it. And I hope it helps answer your question at least a little bit.
Alison, I just want to ask a follow-up question on that. You mentioned avocado oil for high heat. There is the idea in the plant-based world of olive oil becoming carcinogenic when you heat it up.
Mm-hmm.
What is the research that you've seen on that show?
Yeah, I've actually seen some research showing that the smoke point doesn't matter that much, but I haven't seen enough convincing evidence to say that the smoke point doesn't matter. Indeed, it does matter. So extra virgin olive oil smoke point is much lower, more around, I believe it's around 375, 380. And most people that are using olive oil are cooking at higher temperatures than that. So I would encourage the use of the extra virgin olive oil, using it when you're actually using it in a cold way, rather making a salad dressing, etc. And that if you are using oils to heat, that you choose a high heat oil. That's where I would recommend the different use of the oils.
Great, thank you. Our next question is coming from L. L, please state where you're from and ask your question.
Hi, from Columbus, Ohio. My question is, did your cancer center offer whole foods, and how do we encourage hospitals or treatment centers to offer those options?
And I'm not sure if your question relates in terms of the foods in the cafeteria or the ones that are available. So the cancer center, ironically not. So the cancer center that I worked at is the same cancer center that I received treatment at. I had an oncologist that I worked with that sounds kind of funny. Whenever, before I ever had cancer, I said, man, if that ever happens to me, this person will be my oncologist. So I'm actually, and he's a past colleague. We meshed together really well. So it's an outpatient treatment center, and in their cafeteria, for example, they do their best to try to promote health. They don't serve soda or sell soda, for example, because it's not health promoting. However, I do think they need some work done in terms of their foods. I think they do better than the average cancer center or hospital in terms of foods that they're promoting. I can also tell you that I never purchased food while I was there for the cancer treatment center. I also mentioned that I used fasting during the cancer treatment, during chemotherapy. So I actually was never actually eating while I was going to get treatment. And when it comes to answering your question about how do we get cancer centers or hospitals in general to promote more whole foods, honestly, I think a lot of it has to come from the patients or the clientele, because I can tell you, I did a lot of advocating when I worked at the cancer center as a dietitian with the leadership staff, the oncologist promoting nutrition. And oftentimes it was like talking to a brick wall. And so I would tell my staff and the patients when they would bring things up to me, I would say, you have to tell your oncologist this. You can tell me, that's great. I will be happy to relay this information, but you can't just tell the dietitian, because of course the dietitian is going to talk about healthy foods and so forth. It needs to come more from the from the patients and the health members, because the healthcare systems we're starting to see it a little bit more, but they need to listen to what their patients are asking for. And we're seeing a little bit more of a trend that some of the cancer centers are starting to offer more auxiliary services like counseling, acupuncture, some of these other things, because their patients are asking for it. And they know that patients are going to start making their decisions where they get treatment, not necessarily based on the oncologist or vocation, but based on what those services are offered. So first and foremost, I think it needs to come from us as individuals saying what we want. Just like we vote with our pocketbook every time we buy our groceries, we need to start voting with our values and things that we want, so that hopefully we can continue this conversation and there's more understanding and awareness that this is what we need and want in promoting.
Thank you very much. Our next question is going to come from Stephen, who I think asked a question already. So Stephen, go ahead and ask.
Hi, just a quick one. Vertical nail ridges for whole food plant-based, where would you start looking as far as nutritional deficiencies?
Vertical nail ridges, as in terms of that there's vertical nail ridges like occurring in someone?
Yep.
Okay. Yes. So we need to start looking at some micro nutrient deficiencies. And there are different nutrients that play a role in terms of nail beds and nail growth. So we got to start looking at a little bit more of the foundation of some of those nutrients. So for example, like iron intake can impact the nails. There's actually a few of them. But I do encourage, if you want to touch on that a little bit further, feel free to head to my website and I can share some further information with you there through the contact form.
Great. Thank you so much, Alison. That concludes our Q&A for this presentation. Thank you so much for your time. I'd like to open up the mics for the audience, so they can all say thank you to you. I'll get a little crazy for a second. Or
Thank you, Allison.
Thank you.